You're listening to the Great Reassessment Podcast.
Hello, Doomberg. Nice to meet you.
Matthew, great to be here. Congrats on the show, by the way. Looks like you're doing great.
Hey, well, thank you for joining me today and being willing to come on the show. And I know I'm a smaller channel, and so it really means a lot.
Oh, no, I'm always happy to chat and always happy to help out and talk to new creators. And, it's a fun job and glad to see people succeed. You've had some great guests.
Yeah, I am proud of the guests I've been able to acquire, and you being one of them. You were requested from one of my listeners, and so I was happy that we were able to make this happen so quickly.
You bet.
My first question is doesn't really have to do with geopolitics or anything, but just how difficult is it, practically speaking, to maintain anonymity?
We're not super paranoid about it. Lots of people know who we are. We started out anonymous mostly for brand because we decided to face the market as a green chicken, which might sound silly, but in fact, I think was really important to our early success. And as you know, lots of people have a good product, but getting it out there and getting people to read it or to listen to it or to watch it is a challenge. Demand creation is one of the 5 pillars of any business. And so when we first started our project here 4.5 years ago now, which is kind of crazy to say, we decided to build our business on Twitter, to build our audience on Twitter. We obviously built our business on Substack, but so we sort of had a Twitter account that we used to drive impressions and engagements, and then Substack to capture emails, and then eventually we went behind the paywall. And if we had gone to market as just another guy in a tie, it probably wouldn't have stood out, but the green chicken did. And then once we blew up, like beyond our wildest imaginations, we have observed when other sort of anonymous, intriguing brands de-anonymize, much of the brand intrigue dissipates. And so we don't really care. So we don't know is the answer because we haven't really tried to, quote, stay anonymous. 99% of the people respect your wishes, and, what are you going to do?
Yeah. Have you guys, has the sentiment remained the same or changed at all about returning to X or Twitter?
No. We're on Substack. We make our business on Substack, and Twitter is not what it used to be. For those that are unaware, we were a pretty large account, 250,000 followers on Twitter, and then when Elon bought Twitter, he viewed Substack as a competitor, and he began to throttle links to Substack from the platform, which kind of made the whole point of our being there irrelevant. It's also can be a pretty toxic environment, and it was sort of corroding to my brain. I was the one operating the Twitter account. And then finally, Substack launched its own version of Twitter. It's called Notes. And even though it's smaller than Twitter, everybody on Notes is already in the Substack ecosystem. And so it makes more sense for us to participate there. And then last thing I would say in full disclosure is we wrote a significant check to become an investor in Substack during their author-led round. And so, we like to compound our capital around here. And so if we're going to spend time on social media, we figured we might as well do it on Notes. Who knows where we'd be if we had just stayed on Twitter. But at the same time, the business is great. It's growing fine. It's a lot, I see a lot less toxicity in my day. And I still use Twitter. We're still passively on Twitter looking for stories and information and open source intelligence and things like that. But just the grinding of creating content on Twitter for no reward just didn't make it worth it for us.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, opening up, the first round of questions here, big thing in the news yesterday was Trump's 50-day warning to end this war in Russia and Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, rather. What were your initial thoughts to that? Do you think it was a good move by Trump?
No. We have a different view of the current geopolitical situation than most. And the propaganda around this, especially the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, has been incredibly thick. And so what I'm about to say might be jarring to some listeners if they're just getting their news from the legacy media. The fundamental axiom that forms the foundation of our analysis of both the war in Ukraine and that 12-day war that I just mentioned is that the U.S. is chronically short air defense missiles. And there's not much that the U.S. can do about that in the short term. We were shocked when Israel attacked Iran because we knew that the U.S. was short air defense missiles. Israel gets 80% of its air defense missiles from the U.S., and Israel's a small country and vulnerable to missile barrages from Iran. We had written on this previously last October, called October Surprise was the name of the piece. And so we knew immediately when that war broke out, for example, that if the decapitation strike failed and this turned into a war of attrition, that Israel would lose. And our view is that Israel needed that ceasefire, and that's why Trump worked so hard to get it, because we think they were a week or two away of being in significant trouble. And so similar situation in Ukraine. By the way, that axiom is not controversial. It's widely known in the military analysis community. It's also freely admitted to by none other than Trump himself on Air Force One, and by Secretary Rubio in front of Congress. And Zelensky has been begging for air defense missiles for some time. Russia's firing 500, 600, 700 drones and a dozen of missiles or so every night, and there's very little that can be done about it. Again, these are all things that aren't getting reported, but you can observe these things through various mapping projects and so on. And so to answer your question about Trump's announcement, it was kind of a nothing burger. The Russians are going to ignore it. Look, one of the reasons that you should try to avoid war is because sometimes you lose them. And our view is NATO has lost the war in Ukraine badly, and Trump doesn't want to take the L. His instinct is to extend and pretend on this. And so 50 days is just what's going to happen in 50 days. Trump can't actually follow through on the threat. He's not going to put 100% tariffs on India and China, which is what the threat amounts to. Russia doesn't export anything to the U.S. The only meaningful thing Russia exports to the U.S. is something we desperately need over here, which is enriched uranium. And so we're going to make our nuclear reactors more expensive to run to punish Russia. I mean, it's unfortunate. Trump did inherit this situation. He had a short window of time to make a dramatic turn in policy. He decided not to do that, and now staring defeat on, in the face in Ukraine, he's frustrated that Russia won't come to his terms, but the winning side dictates terms. And look, last thing I would say is, the Ukrainians, obviously the biggest victims in this whole mess, are still nowhere near Russia as far as like the terms they would need to end the war. And so this war will end militarily. And so when wars end militarily, the victors get to impose terms. And I think that's what we're going to see here. And so we were rather underwhelmed by yesterday.
What are Russia's exact terms? Do they want a big chunk of land? Is that what they want, or do they want the whole country? Like, what is it?
Yeah. Again, another flaw of Western media is they rarely report what Putin actually says. And last June, I believe, he gave a very long speech where he outlined Russia's terms, and they have not really deviated from those terms. They have hinted that those terms might get worse if the war goes on, but the terms are as follows. So Russia already occupied Crimea before the war, and then there are 4 regions that are predominantly Russian-speaking that are the sort of the tinderbox of this whole situation. Those 4 regions held referendums to vote to join Russia. And of course, people in the West will say those were sham referendums. It's fine. Just giving you the Russian perspective. And so the Russian objectives are to, quote, liberate those 4 regions, which represent about 20% of Ukraine. They want a demilitarized Ukraine, and they want Ukraine not to join NATO. They want to protect the rights of Russian speakers within the rest of Ukraine. And there's another demand that I won't get into, but centers around certain political ideologies in Ukraine that Russia opposes, that it claims are there in large quantities, and that this needs to be cleansed from Ukrainian politics. Of course, all of these demands are rejected out of hand by Ukraine and European leaders. I don't think Trump particularly cares who rules the Russian-speaking part of the Donbass, for example. But those are the terms. They haven't deviated from the terms. Ukraine's position is that every inch of pre-2014 Ukraine needs to be returned, including Crimea, which is just not going to happen. And so they're so far apart on the negotiation that this is going to continue militarily. So I believe Russia occupies all of one of the regions, maybe 80% of another, and maybe 65 or 70% of the other two. And you can see on the map, I follow various mapping projects every day because this is the first real open source war. And you could see, each day how the front line changes, the line of contact changes, and you could see the direction of travel. And Russia's fighting a slow, typically Russian war of attrition. And so now that Ukraine is basically out of air defense missiles, I think Russia feels like it has a significant upper hand. And so they're just going to press their military advantage to the end. And now Russia would say this was all caused by NATO's relentless expansion to the east. Again, people in the West might disagree with that, but that's the Russian view. And so when they talk about root causes to the problem, that's what they mean. They want to have a holistic, security architecture for Europe that respects Russians' interests. Again, I'm just using their words because, I read their words. I read Ukrainian propaganda. I read Western propaganda. I'm bathing in it. And I also read Russian propaganda. And I try to read everybody's propaganda because that's, I believe, one of the best ways to get closer to the truth to the extent that one can find it.
It's sort of like, just from my perspective, right? And it's not super informed. I'll readily admit that, but it seems like legacy media in the United States wants to portray Putin as an incrementalist who is trying to restore the Soviet Union back to its former glory. Do you agree with that?
I mean, I find it hard to understand why people in the West think, Russia's going to roll all the way to France when it's taken them 3.5 years to conquer, 4 regions in eastern Ukraine at significant cost and disruption and death, right? So I believe that if you go back and watch Putin's famous speech at one of the Munich Security Conference, with John McCain sitting in the front row, I think if you read everything Putin's ever said or written, it's been pretty consistent that this is about Russian security on its western borders. Of course, that's not how it's portrayed here, and anybody who ponders whether or not that is true is considered a Russian puppet or, Kremlin payrolls and all that stuff. The propaganda over here is incredibly, incredibly thick. And so, who knows? I'm not there. I've never met the man. I'm not Tucker Carlson. I didn't sit down and interview him. But it seems to me, at least, there's a consistency of the demands. There was an agreement to stop this war, the Istanbul Agreement, as it's known, that was initialed by the Ukrainians, and then those talks fell apart for a variety of reasons. And so I think if Putin were presented with stone cold guarantees that security on Russia's western border would be protected, I don't know that he would be rolling through Poland on the way to Germany and ending up at the Eiffel Tower. But maybe I'm naive.
If you were Tucker Carlson and you could ask Putin a question, what would you ask him?
I thought he did a pretty decent job in that interview, and again, I know what his answers would be, so I don't really have any mysteries to solve with him. He's very carefully spoken and consistent, and so I wouldn't really have anything to add to Tucker's interview. You could just go to the Kremlin's website and read all of the the transcripts of his speeches. They're nice enough to usually publish them in English, and so I think his position is pretty clear. It's not like he's going to answer me, "Hey, do you want to roll on France?" And give me anything other than no, of course not. We're trying to secure our western borders and to make sure that we have a neutral country between us and NATO. That's what he's going to say.
So between Russia, Iran, China, throw in North Korea, it seems like cooperation and diplomacy among them has been increasing. What do you make of all that?
We have been modeling the past 4 years, 3 to 4 years, as the opening phases of World War III, and it's effectively a U.S. dollar war against the BRICS. And I think that's what this war is ultimately all about. This is the focus of those in Washington, D.C., who seem to always be cheerleading for wars. It's about global dominance, U.S. dollar system, financial system. And I think when you read other people's propaganda, this is exactly how they have been portraying it. It's World War III. It's what the Chinese are telling their citizens. It's how the Russians are thinking about it. And so, yeah, that combination of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea is vastly outproducing NATO in weapons simple and complex, as simple as artillery shells and as complex as hyperballistic missiles. And the head of NATO, Mark Rutte, has been openly saying that Russia alone produces more weapons in 3 months than all of NATO does in a year. North Korea spends 20 to 25% of its GDP, as small as it might be, on arms. It has no shortage of labor, obviously. Iran has an enormous inventory of missiles and drone technology. China, of course, is a superpower, uses twice as much electricity as all of the United States. It produces 8 times as much steel as the United States. It's the arsenal of democracy because they make all the weapons for the Raytheons of the world. And so I think that the NATO is wildly overmatched by those 4 countries. And then layer on top of that, Russia has the largest and most technically sophisticated nuclear arsenal on Earth. So even if the West could win a kinetic war against Russia, what do we think they have those weapons for? They would use them. And by the way, so would the U.S. If China were, sending long-range missiles into Mexico and they were reaching Dallas or Oklahoma, I mean, what do you think the U.S. would do in response? Would the U.S. hesitate to threaten to use its nuclear stockpile? Of course it would. But the thing that, again, back to the first axiom of our analysis is the legacy media just continues to assume that the U.S. has an inexhaustible supply of the world's best weapons, and neither of those things is true. The supplies are exhaustible; they are exhausted, and they're no longer even the best weapons. And so Trump, unfortunately, whatever you think of him, and we have mixed thoughts on the man, he always assumes he has escalation dominance. And who actually has escalation dominance is one of the most important things to establish at the beginning of any negotiation. And China, for example, in the trade war has escalation dominance. They just flexed it. Rare earths, which is why the piece we published this morning, I think, was so important, because the U.S. is finally recognizing that the free market does a poor job of pricing national security risk. And so, who has escalation dominance is the first thing that you have to ask yourself.
You said something at the beginning that the potential conflict that could be on the horizon is at the root about the dollar versus maybe a currency that the BRICS nation are proposing. And as a Bitcoiner, right, I maybe you anticipated this question, but where do you think Bitcoin could play in all of this? A decentralized, hard, sound money that is incorruptible and ungovernable.
So we just did a 45, 50-minute long presentation for our pro tier, so the premium tier of Doomberg, where we do a monthly webinar, or recorded presentation, I should say, for that tier, called Goldileo, the yellow rock at the center of our financial universe. And in that presentation, we defined what money is and explained that there actually is no money today. Bitcoin is not money because it fails one of the 3 critical functions of money, which is medium of exchange. So you can't go buy groceries with Bitcoin today. But fiat currencies aren't money either because they fail one of the critical 3 functions of money, which is they're not a store of value. They're continuously debased. And gold is not money because, like Bitcoin, it fails the medium of exchange. So in order for Bitcoin to become money, it needs to be widely accepted for the exchange of goods and services. Now, Bitcoin people will say that, you have the Bitcoin Lightning Network and this is all coming and it's being developed. That's fine. You can't go and fill up your car with gas in the US or anywhere else that I'm aware of using Bitcoin today. So
you can do it a Steak and Shake.
Yeah, well, sure. But doesn't mean that it can't be a good store of value. Look, the overlap in the Venn diagram of the reasons why people own gold and the reasons why people own Bitcoin that overlap is very high. So we actually have a lot of Bitcoiners who read us. We don't own any crypto. I've never owned Bitcoin. I do own a fair bit of gold for probably similar reasons. There's one little nuance with Bitcoin that I think is important, and in a way, I don't know if you follow Mike Benz on Twitter, but he's a fascinating Twitter account, and he's been talking a lot lately about stablecoins. And if the on ramp for most people into the crypto world is through a stablecoin, and they are now going to be, if these crypto bills pass Congress this week, which we anticipate they will, they're going to try to create a mania in stablecoins because they need that bid for short-term treasuries. So the fact that stablecoins are being regulated in the U.S. And for most people, the on ramp is through a stablecoin. They're parking their money at a Tether, and then Tether is turning around buying short-term treasuries. That's just a way of rolling over the U.S. refinancing wall and, ironically, extending or delaying the decline of the U.S. dollar system. And I think that's one of the things that's going on in a proactive aspect of Trump and Scott Bessent's strategy. So you don't have to buy U.S. treasuries to get access to gold, for example. And so gold, we think actually there's a significant risk of confiscation for gold, which we talked about in that presentation as well, for all the reasons that you can imagine that they might, outlaw the owning of Bitcoin as well.
That would be crazy.
It's not our base case, but gold has more of a risk to that because,
Yeah, I mean, because you can physically take it.
Correct.
And
they've done it before.
Yes. Was it 1940?
30s.
No, 19, yeah. Executive Order 6102.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at just the world through monetary terms, right? Like, I think you're right when this is sort of one of the symptoms of this is the U.S. is desperately trying to hold on to the U.S. dollar as the dominant currency of the world. You've seen the BRICS nations challenging that. Are they trying to create a currency that is backed by gold? The BRICS
No, so we could talk about that because there's some misunderstanding about what the BRICS are trying to do. They're trying to create a system of global trade that circumvents the dollar. That doesn't need to be a currency per se, but it does need a neutral reserve asset because right now the dominant reserve asset held by central banks around the world is in fact U.S. Treasuries, although that lead is slipping. But the U.S. Treasuries are no longer neutral, and they're not perceived as neutral because they've been seized, well, frozen, at least. The Russian assets have been frozen, which was we think, catastrophic blunder for the long-term prospects of the U.S. dollar system. And so if it's not neutral, it no longer can serve that key role. And in fact, if gold returns as neutral reserve asset for the settling of imbalances in international trade, it becomes more money, at least at the central bank level, because it is then widely accepted by central bankers for that purpose. And so what the BRICS are building, if you read the readout from the latest summit in Brazil, is not necessarily a currency, it is an ecosystem of payment settlements, basically. And you can imagine central bank digital currencies playing a role in that, maybe backed by gold, who knows? But yeah, that's what they're building. So when people say there's no alternative for the US dollar, I don't think they really understand what the BRICS are trying to do, which is to get out of the system.
Well, maybe that's where, who knows, maybe Bitcoin will come into play. I mean, why don't they just use a cross-border settlement payment system using Bitcoin?
It's a little too volatile for that purpose, I think. At least now, who knows what the future holds? I mean, sure, you could use anything that everybody accepts. But widely accepted is one of the key attributes of money. And so,
no, yeah, you're right. It definitely is, and I think it's going to get there. You're seeing more institutional adoption of Bitcoin, both in like mom and pop shops. There's a few storefronts around here where I live where people will accept Bitcoin as a form of payment. Steak and Shake is I know it's just a burger joint, but it's one that They're a national organization, and I was just in Florida last week, and I made my first Bitcoin transaction over the Lightning Network, and I went there 3 times actually because it was so much fun to, spend
Good for you.
Bitcoin.
It's like
And the burgers are really good. They fry their French fries in beef tallow.
it sounds like you're the new Bitcoin pizza guy, yeah.
Maybe, but there's hundreds and thousands of people who have been, beat me to the.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
No, look, I mean that has to happen. I understand the case. The thing about Bitcoin that I find interesting, and like we've hardly ever said a bad word about Bitcoin, and yet the fact that we don't own it seems to irritate so many people.
Mm.
So our financial strategy is very simple. We earn money in fiat, right? We live in the fiat world. We save by buying real assets, and we invest privately where we can impact the outcome. I don't own any stocks either, to speak of. And so, like, Bitcoin would be an option that we might allocate some of our savings pool to, but we already have gold for that purpose, and it works fine. And so I just never really owned it. But like I don't begrudge people who own it. I hope it goes to 1 million. I've got lots of friends who own it, and I don't get jealous when my friends make a lot of money. I'm happy for them, and I don't lament missing out on it because I live a great life. And so I just don't own Bitcoin. Don't need Bitcoin. I certainly understand all the arguments for it, um, and understand why people are enthusiastic about it. But I don't understand why sort of a purity test is whether you've actually owned it.
Certainly. And, I know there are a lot of enthusiasts who, maybe they'll hear somebody doesn't own any Bitcoin, or, they believe in freedom and sound money principles, but then they find out that they don't own Bitcoin, and all of a sudden they think that that person's, a loser or something like that. And I don't certainly fall into that category. I think, yeah, I like gold. I like owning assets, and, you got to live somewhere, right? So you might need to own a house. You can't just say, oh, well, you should have bought Bitcoin instead of a house. Um,
Yeah. Look, I own lots of real estate.
yeah,
My savings strategy is gold, land, and collectibles that I have some knowledge about. And
yeah,
and I have pleasure collecting. And so
yeah.
like the value, I view the things in the savings category as raising the floor of my net worth. Right? There's only so bad it can be, even in a hyperinflationary environment. If I own my home outright and I own X number of acres of farmland and X number of acres of forest land and X number of collectible watches that I love to wear and know a lot about. And the gold coins in my safe, and then maybe a little bit of fizz in my retirement account, and off I go. If I were to ever buy quote unquote Bitcoin, I wouldn't actually go into the crypto world. Now there's just so many ways to get leverage to the price of Bitcoin, which is just through the ETFs, right? But I don't speculate, right? So like for example, I don't actually. I observe the price of gold not for the value of the gold that I own or my exposure to it, but for the value of the US dollar and what the market is telling me about it. I take the inverse of it.
Yeah, it's really a measurement of how fast the dollar is falling.
Right. I posted last night, one of the great fallacies of finance is that people think the DXY is a measure of US dollar strength. It's not. It's a measure of how the US dollar is trading against the euro, the yen, and the pound. Who cares?
Yeah.
The real U.S. dollar strength is how many ounces of gold you can buy with it, or pick your favorite asset that you like, Bitcoin. And when Nixon took the U.S. off the gold window, it cost you $35 to get an ounce, and now we've debased the U.S. dollar 100-fold in 50 years.
That's absolutely right. Jeff Booth, you might know who he is. He's an author, but I interviewed him, and he said something that was, I feel like it was plainly obvious, but I'd never heard it before. A currency shouldn't measure other currencies. It should measure things.
Yeah.
And can you buy more things with it than you did last year, or can you buy less things with it now?
Right.
That's the sign
So
of a currency.
yeah, that's the unit of account function of money. Anything can be the unit of account, but you also have to understand that like it should be stable, right? Like the reason why people settled on gold for money is because you could read Lynn Alden's book, which is great. I highly recommend it. Broken Money, I believe it's called. I'm sure you know Lynn or know of her work. Gold has a great stock to flow ratio. It's pretty stable. There's only so much of it mined every year. There's no real dramatic ways to suddenly increase its supply, and there's lots of it. So and it's easily divisible, and all the good things about money. The only thing missing, owning gold is missing, is widely accepted. every other attribute of money is checked off by gold. And people could make the same argument for Bitcoin, and they do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting what they're trying to do with like the Utah goldbacks, those that they're like gold notes pretty much. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I find all state level attempts kind of more showy than substance. Until the U.S. dollar is backed and exchangeable for physical,
The
that
one question that's open about what is the best form of, store value or money. I believe Bitcoin is money. Not, I know it's not widely accepted, but you can spend it. What if you had to flee to another country?
yeah, I don't plan to do that. My kids were born here.
Yeah.
Gonna stand my ground, defend my castle. If they put me in jail, they put me in jail. There's no real escaping the system, at least not using tactics that I would be willing to do.
Hmm.
And so I try to follow the laws. I speak my mind. I certainly, Doomberg is we think still protected by the umbrella of free speech. We do color within the lines. We are provocative, but we're not super polarizing, as I'm sure you know. And so, in a world where it's kind of like prepping, so I'm a prepper, right? And by the way, I don't view the word prepper as derogatory in any way, shape, or form. I think prepping is responsibility. Um, I don't really store for more than 30 to 40 days because my view is if a catastrophe hits so hard that things aren't, you know, out of the mess in 45 days, do I really want to be around? Like I don't plan to survive a zombie apocalypse. I get that. There's certainly an attribute. You could fit a lot of value in a thumb drive and you could cross the border with it and nobody would know. You can't do that with gold. You can't do that with cash because then you'd have to open an account to put it somewhere, right? But you can do it with Bitcoin. That's undeniably an attribute, but I would counter that wallets can be frozen, right? And we saw what happened with the trucker protests in Canada, right? Now, again, there are ways to get around that, and I'm sure people listening would tell me that there's technologies to solve all these problems, and I agree, right? So there's no doubt that the ability to flee with a lot of value is one attribute of Bitcoin that people find attractive. It's just not an option that I would ever pursue, so that attribute is not necessarily compelling to me.
Yeah. Well, fair enough. Switching gears back to politics, what are you currently meditating on? Like, what is the most important thing happening politically right now in your eyes?
I think it's not something we've written about directly. How does Europe and the European Union in particular persist in the next 5, 10 years? The resentment, the political anger, the tone deafness of its leaders, the economic fractures, the deindustrialization, the suicide mission it seems to be on from an energy perspective. That which can't go on forever usually doesn't. And we don't know how the European Union survives from here now. With one important caveat is that people have been calling for the death of the European Union since the European Union was a thing. Boy, when you see basically the stolen election in Romania, trying to outlaw political parties in Germany, people going to jail by their hundreds in Britain for tweets. Macron is probably the most unpopular leader in the world, still hanging around. Ursula von der Leyen, I mean, could there be a more out of touch bureaucrat in the world? They make none of their own energy. I'll get fascinating, statistics for you. We did the math. The European Union, the 27 member states of the European Union, which of course does not include Great Britain and Norway, the European Union consumes about 40 exajoules of energy every year from hydrocarbons, 40 exajoules of oil, gas, and coal. And the region produces 6 exajoules of oil, gas, and coal, mostly coal, which means they have to import 34 exajoules a year from outside sources. Now, just to benchmark that for you, that's roughly the total US natural gas production. If you measured it in exajoules, it's like 37 exajoules. So whenever you import energy, which is why energy is such a great framework for our geopolitical analysis, It explains so much, and so few people actually look at things through that lens. If you're importing energy, natural gas, coal, oil, every entity that touches that product along the way, from wherever it is produced to delivery, needs to earn their cost of capital. Right? This is why Russia is outproducing NATO by wide margins, because it's an energy superpower. Europe is a flaccid energy vassal. And this is why industry is leaving. It's physics, it's thermodynamics. It's right there. The U.S. has a chance because the U.S. is the world's largest producer of energy and still has a reasonable manufacturing base. And to Trump's credit, he is trying to reinvigorate that base, which we unabashedly support, as you probably read in our piece this morning. Europe they're nowhere near that level of thinking. They think, every failure of renewable energy is just held up as proof that there needs to be more. Mm. And so, like, we wrote a piece called Project Porcupine. Like, they're not going to rearm. They literally don't have the jewels. It takes steel to make tanks. It takes energy to make bombs. What are bombs? They're concentrated forms of energy, that you release in a small area to destroy things. I mean, all wars are energy wars. World War II was won because, the U.S. predominantly was the world's largest oil producer by a wide margin. It was started with Japan because, FDR cut Japan off of oil. Energy explains everything, and Europe has none.
Wow. So they consume 40, but they produce 6.
And they're shutting down their nuclear plants, right? I mean, Germany at least.
To bring up Bitcoin again, however...
no, you don't.
I don't, but, I don't want to be insufferable.
No, it's fine.
People will point to, the opportunities to, for Bitcoin mining in, remote parts of the earth where, you can capture cheap energy and monetize it, and you can produce value and subsidize costs for, the places where it is, or you can transfer the value of that energy. What do you think about all that?
Yeah, so that doesn't help Europe because it doesn't produce any, and it only partially solves half of the intermittency problem with renewables. And perhaps
you can theoretically go and find it in waterfalls in uncharted territory. You could go,
sure, but that doesn't bring energy back to Europe. So in other words,
it could bring value though, like monetize.
Right. But the energy that Europe needs to build stuff is not aided by Bitcoin. So Bitcoin, let me complete my sentence or the thought that I articulated in a sentence, which is Bitcoin partially solves half of the intermittency problem. So if you have a lot of solar in a grid, it hurts you both ways. When the sun doesn't shine, a huge amount of your capacity goes offline. And when the sun shines brightly, you have way too much energy being produced. Bitcoin mining could help shave the excess energy and allow renewable developers to make more money. Because, by the way, ironically, what happens is when the sun is shining, electricity prices crash because there's too much of it. Load matching is a critical part of operating a grid. But Bitcoin does not give energy back, so it's not like a battery, right? And so there's no assistance that Bitcoin can provide when the sun isn't shining, and either backup power or, fossil fuel peaking plants or hydrocarbon peaking plants are needed to keep the lights on. And so we've written in support of Bitcoin mining at natural gas peaker plants, for example, because they're just not economically viable operating part of the time. And so you operate them all the time and then switch from mining to aiding the grid, and then at least your peaker plants become economical. But that doesn't solve Europe's problem in this context.
Thanks for that. As we start to wrap up here, one thing that's been in the news, it seems like it's nonstop, is, and maybe I can get you to comment on it. I know it might not be in the frame of geopolitics and energy and all those things, but could I get you to comment on what you think is going on with the Epstein client list and Trump kind of rolling back, squashing the issue, sweeping it under the rug, and him losing some of his base as a result of it?
Yeah, look, I mean, it isn't something we would write about. And as a general rule, we try not to talk about things that we would never write about. But as an outside observer, I think this puts his presidency in significant jeopardy. I mean, You can't campaign on an issue like that and then just effectively gaslight everybody. Um, I'm sure it's got to be a terrible story. I'm sure it is a terrible story. It doesn't have to be. It just is a terrible story. And it must run so deep that it just can't be released even by Trump. People on the left will say he can't release it because he's in it. I find that difficult to believe because if he was in it, I doubt that the Democrats would have resisted to use that against him. But who knows? Maybe it's mutually assured destruction on all sides. But I just think objectively, it's not going to work. What he's trying to do, which is just bury to move on and distract. One of the dangers, though, is perhaps we have a wag the dog situation where they need a war, an escalation as a distraction. I know it's not something I'm an expert in. I've only see what I see peripherally on Twitter, but I found that very long and awkwardly written Truth Social post, the first ever Truth Social post that he's posted that got ratioed, was not a good look.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think there's probably any number of possibilities on why, but it seems like they went down this, they had the Epstein phase 1 and client list being released, and it's just it feels like some sort of rollback, like out of 1984. Like they're just trying to say, oh, and like when they're destroying all the documents, things like that,
Yeah.
it never existed, and it has to either be so bad that there's people on both sides that are super powerful and it's in their interests to cooperate. I mean, that's just my speculation, but
Sure.
what else could it be?
Let me tell you how we try to learn from situations like this, even if it's not in our zone of expertise. So, for example, we have lists of left-leaning influencers and right-leaning influencers. We try to follow both. And it's interesting to partition the right-leaning influencers into those that are truly only and always about Trump and those who have core principles. And we're seeing this civil war playing out on Twitter between those two sides right now. It is fracturing the base, really, which is why it's so dangerous for Trump, because the polarity in the U.S. is very, very high, and the majorities of other sides, either side is very thin, right? And so you can't lose much of your base without losing your grip on power. And so if 5-10% of Trump's base doesn't turn out for the midterms because of this issue, it's not good for Trump's congressional support, right? So, but observing who are ideologues as opposed to partisans is an interesting observation. And so then you put those accounts in the back of your mind as, okay, that's a partisan. This person is an ideologue. By the way, we think you should be ideological. You shouldn't be partisan on every issue. There are some issues that we agree with wholeheartedly with Trump, predominantly energy. Chris Wright's a great pick for Secretary of Energy. That doesn't mean we support other aspects of his policies, or we can't observe that the tariff policy has been rather clumsily rolled out and acknowledge it, right? We have contacts in industry who are being crushed by just the uncertainty. So but there's certain accounts on Twitter, and again, back to your point about Bitcoin, right? Like the partisans versus the ideologues, right? Like I think you can have deep-rooted support for Bitcoin for the reasons you've articulated, and still have civil conversations with people who don't own any of it. So this is one thing that we have observed throughout this whole thing, right? Like some of these influencers truly are ideologues and won't go along with whatever Trump says just because Trump's saying it. And in fact, we saw that during the Israel-Iran war as well. A lot of resistance to that war amongst the MAGA movement as well. So
Yeah, the ideologues versus the partisans. And I'm shocked when I look at my Twitter feed. Some of the quote unquote right wing commentators or who I follow I'm shocked that they're just going along with this. They're saying, you know what?
yeah,
I don't like it, but I'm gonna trust the administration. But then you have others like, like Matt Walsh. He will not let this go. And
Jack Poso and Tucker and
yes.
um, there's a whole cadre of them. Yeah, it is shocking to see. That's what I mean. Like, so, like you observe that behavior in an account that you follow, then you just objectively have to treat that account differently
Yeah.
mentally going forward. And by the way, this is a really important point, probably a great one as we wrap up. But like, we started this conversation with propaganda, right? We're all bathing in propaganda, but nobody who's bathing, very few people who are bathing in propaganda like to admit it. We start with the assumption that everything is wrong and then develop open source intel sources, do our own analysis, facts and figures, and come up with our own independent conclusions to the best we can, recognizing that we too are bathing in a sea of propaganda. And that's how we were able to get the oil price action correct during the war with Iran. We knew what that strike meant on Saturday night, the moment it came out. It meant that the war was over. Israel needed a ceasefire, and the attacks were largely performative. And the oil markets nailed it. They saw through this from the beginning, and they reacted accordingly. And so, markets are a great source. For example, the price of gold is a source of intelligence. The price of Bitcoin is a measure of many things.
Mhm.
You have to develop your own sources, and so, but you also have to be cognizant of the fact that those sources might reveal aspects about them that you have to change your assumption about them. And I think both the war in Iran and now this whole affair that we've just been discussing is pretty revelatory, and that's useful. Again, as if you're an analyst, all intelligence is useful.
Yeah, I think that is a great note to end on. Doomberg, thank you so much. It has been a true honor and a pleasure to chat with you today. And yeah, maybe we can do it again sometime.
You bet, and keep going at it. I know you're in the early days here, but you got to do your best, keep cracking away, and if you produce a high quality product, you'll find your audience.
Hey, thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too.